There's something in the Mojave Desert that I've been trying to make sense of for a while now, and the more I look into it, the less sense it makes. It's a trail. Just a trail. A line in the dirt. But this line has been there for somewhere around 3,000 years, maybe longer, and it's still visible today. You can see it on Google Earth. You can stand next to it and see it cutting across the desert floor, clear as a sidewalk. And nobody, not archaeologists, not historians, not the tribes whose ancestors likely made it, nobody can say for certain why it's there. I want to walk you through everything I've found on this, because I think it's one of the most overlooked things in the entire American Southwest. So let's start with what we're actually looking at. If you go out into the Mojave, somewhere between Barstow and Baker along the Interstate 15 corridor, and you get off the highway and drive out into the desert a few miles, you'll start to see it. A line. Not a road, not a wash, not a tire track. A line that cuts through the desert pavement in a more or less straight direction and just keeps going. Desert pavement is the key to understanding why this is still visible after thousands of years. Most people think of the desert as sand, but a lot of the Mojave isn't sand at all. It's this hard, flat surface covered in small, dark rocks. Over thousands of years, wind and rain push the rocks into a tight layer, almost like a cobblestone street. They call it desert pavement, and once it forms, it's incredibly stable. It can last for tens of thousands of years if nobody disturbs it. But if you do disturb it, if you move the rocks, or walk on it enough to push the rocks aside, you expose the lighter soil underneath. And that contrast between the dark rocks and the light soil is visible from far away, from the ground, from a plane, from a satellite. That's what these trails are. Thousands of years of human footsteps pushed the dark rocks aside and exposed the lighter ground beneath. And because the desert pavement reforms so slowly, the trails are still there. They'll probably be there for thousands of years more, unless someone drives over them with an off-road vehicle, which unfortunately does happen. Now, trails in the Mojave aren't unheard of. There are plenty of documented Native American trails throughout the desert. The Mojave Road, which connected the Colorado River to the coast, is probably the most famous one. Parts of it were used for thousands of years by different groups. The Mojave, the Kemehuevi, the Serrano, and others. Traders, hunters, families moving between seasonal camps. That trail makes sense. It connected water sources. It followed a logical route through the desert. You can look at a map and understand why someone would walk that path. But the trails I'm talking about are different. And the reason they're different is that some of them don't seem to connect anything. Let me explain what I mean by that. When archaeologists study ancient trails, the first thing they look for is what's at each end. Trails are practical things. People made them because they needed to get from one place to another. So you'd expect a trail to connect a village to a water source, or a quarry to a camp, or one settlement to another. Point A to point B. Some of the trails in this part of the Mojave do that. You can trace them and they lead to known water sources, known habitation sites, known resource areas. Those trails are well understood. They were transportation routes. Simple. But there are others that don't lead to any known site. They run in straight lines across the desert for miles and then just fade out. No village at the end, no spring, no quarry, no known campsite. They go from somewhere to nowhere, or at least nowhere that we can identify today. And some of them are incredibly straight. Unnaturally straight, some would say. If you're walking across the desert on a practical journey, You don't walk in a perfectly straight line. You go around obstacles. You follow the terrain. You angle toward landmarks. A functional trail meanders, at least a little. These trails don't meander. Some of them are straight for miles. Like someone stretched a string across the desert and said, "Walk here." There are a few theories about what these trails were for, and I want to go through each of them because I think they're all interesting, even the ones I don't fully buy. The first and most common theory is that they're simply trade routes or travel routes that connected to places that no longer exist. A spring that dried up, a camp that was seasonal, a resource that was used up. Over 3,000 years, things change. Water sources that existed in 1000 BC may not exist today. Villages that thrived during wetter periods may have been abandoned when the climate shifted. So the trail looks like it goes nowhere. But 3,000 years ago, it went somewhere important. That's a reasonable theory. The Mojave's climate has shifted over the millennia. Lake Mojave, which is now a dry lake bed, was once a real lake with fish in it. The region was wetter thousands of years ago, and there were water sources and habitation sites that are completely gone now. So it's entirely possible that these trails made perfect, practical sense when they were created, and we've simply lost the other end of the story. But there's a problem with that theory. If these were just standard travel routes, you'd expect them to show signs of heavy repeated use over long periods. And some of them do. But others look like they were made deliberately in a short period of time. The trail is uniform. It doesn't have the worn, variable look of a path that thousands of people walked over centuries. It looks more like a group of people walked this line once, on purpose, and it stayed. That leads to the second theory, the ceremonial theory. Several researchers, including some who have worked with tribal consultants from the region, believe that at least some of these trails were created for spiritual or ceremonial purposes. They weren't trails in the way we think of trails. They weren't for getting from one place to another. They were the purpose in themselves. There's a concept in several Native American traditions of a spiritual journey that is also a physical journey, walking a specific path across the landscape as a form of prayer, or vision-seeking, or marking a connection to the land. The path isn't a means to an end. The path is the ritual. In some traditions of the human-speaking peoples, which includes the Mojave, the Quechan, and others in the region, there are stories about creator beings who walked across the land in the earliest times. The trails they walked became sacred, and in some interpretations, humans would later walk those same paths as a way of connecting to those creation stories. If that's what these trails are, physical expressions of spiritual journeys, then it makes sense that they wouldn't lead to a practical destination. The destination isn't the point. The walk is the point. This theory is supported by the fact that some of these trails are associated with geoglyphs. There are a number of geoglyphs in this area of the Mojave, figures and shapes made on the desert floor by clearing or arranging rocks. Some of them are near trail networks. The most famous are the Blythe intaglios down near the Colorado River, which are giant human and animal figures scraped into the desert surface. Those are believed to be ceremonial in nature, and there are trail networks associated with them. There's also the question of who made these trails, and that's more complicated than you'd think. There were a number of groups that lived in or passed through this area over the last several thousand years. The Vanyume lived along the Mojave River. The Kemehuevi were to the north. The Mojave traded through the region regularly on their way to the coast. The Serrano were to the west. Each group had their own relationship with the landscape and their own reasons for moving through it. But there's also a group that's essentially a ghost in the historical record. The Spanish called them the Desert Mojave, or sometimes the Land Mojave. When the first Spanish explorers came through in the 1770s, they found large abandoned settlements along the Mojave River. Their Mojave guides told them that a group called the Land Mojave had once lived there but had been driven out or wiped out by conflict and drought long before the Spanish arrived. Nobody knows for certain who these people were. They disappeared before any European could document their culture. Some historians think they were a branch of the Mojave. Others think they were a distinct group. Either way, they left no written record, and whatever oral history existed about them is fragmentary at best. Some researchers have wondered if the trails and geoglyphs in this area that don't match the known styles of the Vanyume or Chemehuevi might be remnants of the Land Mojave. Their last physical traces, lines on the ground left by a people who are otherwise completely gone from the record. That's speculative. There's no way to prove it with current evidence. But it's one of those ideas that sits with you once you hear it. A trail made by people who no longer exist, going to a place that no longer exists, for a reason that nobody remembers. So the idea that trails could be ceremonial isn't a stretch. It's documented in other parts of the desert. The question is whether these specific trails in the Barstow-Baker corridor are part of that tradition, and that's where the certainty ends. The tribes in this area have their own knowledge about these places, and not all of it is shared publicly, which is their right. The third theory is astronomical, and this one I find fascinating, even though the evidence is thin. A few researchers have noticed that some of these straight trails align with astronomical events: solstice sunrise directions, equinox lines, star positions. The idea is that the trails were built as astronomical markers, essentially giant compasses drawn on the desert floor that track the movement of the sun or stars. This isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. Cultures all over the world built structures aligned with astronomical events. Stonehenge, the pyramids, Chaco Canyon right here in the Southwest. The difference is that those are structures, buildings, walls. These are just lines on the ground. But a line on the ground in the desert, if it's straight enough and long enough, can function as a pretty accurate astronomical sight line. Stand at one end, look down the trail, and if it's aligned to the solstice sunrise, you know exactly what day of the year it is. For a culture that depended on seasonal cycles for food, water, and migration, that would have been valuable information. The problem is that when you have enough straight lines going in enough directions, some of them are going to align with astronomical events by pure coincidence. So the astronomical theory is hard to prove or disprove. It's suggestive, not conclusive. There's a fourth theory that I should mention, even though I don't personally give it much weight. And that's the alien theory. Ley lines, extraterrestrial navigation markers, landing guides for spacecraft. You can find this stuff on the internet pretty easily. I think if beings could cross the distance between stars, they probably don't need a line of cleared rocks in the California desert to find their way. But I mention it because it comes up a lot, and I want to be thorough. So where does that leave us? Honestly, it leaves us with a mystery. There are lines on the desert floor in the Mojave that have been there for 3,000 years or more. Some of them make practical sense as travel or trade routes. Some of them don't seem to connect to anything. Some of them are so straight that they appear to be deliberately constructed, not gradually worn by foot traffic. And the people who made them left no written records, and the oral traditions that might explain them are either lost or held privately by the tribes. What we're left with is the trails themselves, and they're not going anywhere, in both senses of the word. They don't lead to any place we can identify, and they're not going to disappear anytime soon. They'll probably outlast every highway and interstate in California. 1,000 years from now, when I-15 is dust, these trails will still be there. Faint lines in the desert, made by people who walked them for reasons we'll probably never fully understand. I think there's something humbling about that. We live in a time where we think we can explain everything. We have satellites. We have ground-penetrating radar. We have LiDAR. We have databases of every archaeological site ever recorded. And we still can't figure out why someone walked in a straight line across the Mojave 3,000 years ago. The desert keeps its secrets better than anywhere else on Earth. The dry air preserves things. The pavement holds the marks. But it doesn't preserve the reasons, the why behind the what. And that's the part that matters most. One more thing I want to mention. These trails are fragile. I know that sounds strange for something that has lasted 3,000 years, but they are. One off-road vehicle can destroy a section of trail in seconds that took millennia to preserve. And it happens. People go out there in trucks and ATVs, and they have no idea what they're driving over. Once those dark rocks are scattered, the contrast is gone. The trail disappears, and whatever information was encoded in that path is lost forever. I've seen it on satellite imagery. You can trace a trail for a mile or two, and then it crosses a dirt road or an OHV area, and it's gone. Just erased. And you know that trail continued on the other side at some point, but there's no way to recover it now. The BLM manages a lot of this land, and they've done some work to document and protect archaeological sites in the desert. But the reality is there's too much land and not enough people. The Mojave is enormous. You can't fence off every trail and every geoglyph. Most of them aren't even mapped. They're just out there, slowly being erased by people who don't know they exist. It reminds me of something I read once about how much history we lose, not because anyone destroys it on purpose, but because nobody realizes it's there in the first place. That's the Mojave in a nutshell. The ground is covered in history that looks like nothing if you don't know what you're looking at. There's a Bill Mann book called Guide to 50 Interesting and Mysterious Sites in the Mojave that documents some of these trails. Mann spent decades in the Mojave cataloging things like this, and even he admitted there were trails he found that he couldn't explain. He said the Mojave has more secrets per square mile than any place he'd ever been. I'm inclined to agree with him. If you've ever been out in this part of the Mojave, or if you've seen these trails on satellite imagery, I'd love to hear about it. And if you know of any research or tribal accounts that shed light on what these trails were for, drop it in the comments. I'm still piecing this together, and every bit helps. Thanks for listening.